Forte. Identifying climate-smart agriculture in CARICOM, small farmers and climate change. I left the Caribbean Week of Agriculture Conference in Antigua in 2012 with the belief that I would actually be returning to ordinary time. Personally, I had no way of promoting the findings of my synthesis study, and I had no idea what the CWA would do with this proceedings. However, 2 years later, in 2014, another invitation came to me from the ICA office in Barbados. This project was entitled Smallholder Rural Producers and Climate-Smart Agricultural Production and Marketing in English Caribbean, Profile and Analysis. It was a convenient convergence of common interests from different perspectives. The project was funded by the International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD, an international financial institution dedicated to eradicating poverty and hunger in rural areas of developing countries. I needed more information about the resilience potential of the agricultural sector in the Caribbean to climate change effects so as to reduce rural poverty. Mrs. Ina Harvey was at that time head of the ICA office in Barbados. ICA, IICA, the long form of its name is the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture, was leading the charge in cooperation with the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, known euphemistically as the 5 Cs. Their mandate was to empower Caribbean people to act on climate change. The unique nature of this project was that it sought to incorporate an interface between climate change science and agricultural policy. Besides being about reducing rural poverty in the Caribbean, the project had a second question to answer. That was, how do we coordinate science and policy to meet the new challenges to Caribbean agriculture? This question had very serious implications, managing the willingness of smallholders in the agricultural sector to accept climate change resilience initiatives. We needed to determine the essential steps to take to increase both awareness and action on climate change impact in Caribbean agriculture at the smallholders level. Having asked the Caribbean researchers at the CWA to make their science relevant, I was now about to find out the answers myself. ICA had decided to hire the best agricultural consultants in each island who had both an understanding of the science behind the climate change challenge and were also familiar with small-scale farming in the region. 7 specialists were hired to cover the remaining member countries of CARICOM with the exception of Haiti. There were Alan Williams, reporting on Trinidad and Tobago and Barbados; Steve Maxime, reporting on Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts Nevis, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines; Diane Roberts, reporting on Grenada, Dominica, and Guyana; Robert Tejean, reporting on Suriname; Kevin Riney, reporting on Jamaica; Clifford Martinez, reporting on Belize; and Stacy Moultrie, reporting on the Bahamas. Then, just before the commencement of the project in January 2014, I got a call from Ina Harvey herself, asking if I would be willing to accept the role of regional coordinator for the entire exercise. This added two new tasks. The first was to conduct a preview of methodologies in use to incorporate climate change science with agricultural policy and to choose an appropriate one. The second was to lead the consultancy team in how to identify within farming systems the effects of climate change on the rural sector, vulnerabilities and adaptation strategies, and the institutional framework. In a nutshell, I was being asked to build the whole approach from the bottom up. Team members were to be encouraged to include information on trends and forecasts, economic impacts, and risks analysis, as well as any existing maps of hotspots or areas with vulnerabilities to climate change. Furthermore, they were required to provide 2 case studies in a particular farming community or an indigenous group where they exist, so as to gain insights into their application of traditional knowledge and practices in climate change adaptation. Coordinating regional research. As the regional coordinator, I was called upon to play the role of the kingpin of the project. This had several aspects. First, I was asked to develop the methodology for the project, complete with guidelines for data analysis, organization of results, and design of a framework for the reports. Then I would be required to compile a regional summary of all the country reports, with analysis of the information obtained from interviews and consultations with key stakeholders. Finally, I was required to compile a report on the lessons learned from the case studies, formulating recommendations on opportunities for country clustering of outcomes at a regional level, and making a comprehensive presentation of the same at a regional workshop. This edition not only extended my participation to 9 months, but it was a bonanza for me. It was the ideal opportunity to compile and document current data and information on rural smallholder producers in the Caribbean, their production systems, climate change mitigation measures, and to examine opportunities and barriers for smallholders' full participation in rural commercial enterprises. It felt like my most recent activities were starting to pay dividends. I had just completed a 3-year stint in trying to improve knowledge on best practices for rural smallholders in the critical watersheds of Trinidad. This was all aimed at building resilience to climate change effects so that they would benefit from new rural entrepreneurship opportunities. Only 2 years earlier, I was involved in an effort to have the OECS Secretariat adopt a poverty reduction strategy that further convinced me of the need to make land and small-scale farming into true legacy assets of the poor. The system keeps reproducing itself. There were other issues that I needed to resolve in my mind. One was geospatial, and the other was interpretive. On the geospatial side, I encouraged our team to step outside of the conventional definitions of rural and urban, and to consider the residents in these islands as functioning in a rural-urban continuum, in which the urban represented the best opportunities for income generation, and the rural had a high probability of income failure. On the interpretive side, I wanted our team to move away from the notion that small farmers will adapt to the impact of climate change simply on the basis of the knowledge and information they receive. This adaptiveness on the part of the smallholders should rely more on the perceptions or interpretations of the information and that such perception may be guided by where they viewed their potential on this very urban-rural continuum. In other words, if climate and weather patterns continued to frustrate farmers, they were more likely to leave farming, or at least discourage their children from entering the sector. We were therefore encouraged to guide the content of our surveys towards eliciting stronger indications of perceptions that may be used to support implementable climate change action. Population trajectory of small landholders in the Caribbean had to be another observation on the interpretation of adaptive capacity of small farmers. This was a growing dichotomy facing small-scale agriculture in the Caribbean. Most Caribbean writers were lamenting the fact that the Caribbean was losing its farming population and becoming less able to feed itself. Indeed, the question of a high level of food imports still plagues us today. In addition to the numerous studies of methods to increase both productivity and the number of small farms in the region, climate change resilience was one of the tools in this fight. But history will repeat itself as long as we fail to intervene. I am naturally forced to look at the problem of the dwindling farm population from a historical perspective. If the small farming population fails to reproduce itself, their numbers would either decrease or at least remain the same. The latter, remaining constant, may look like a failure to us, but in most cases, either of these results would be interpreted as a success in legacy terms for the small farmer. Most small farmers didn't want their children to remain in farming. So why are we expressing surprise that the farming population is dwindling? A dwindling small farming population is considered a legacy success for them. If the numbers remain the same or decline, then the conditions that are reproducing themselves must be losing their impact. We needed to identify and break those conditions in order to build a new commitment to farming in the Caribbean. Once more, Haiti can be a useful historical reference of system dynamics that seem ingrained into the recesses of memory of our small farmers. It was reported that at the time of the Haitian Revolution, upwards of 70% of the slaves were not born in Haiti, but in Africa. That meant that over 286 years, from 1517 to 1802, after kidnapped Africans were first brought to Haiti, the system was failing to reproduce itself. The death rate in the slave population in most Caribbean islands exceeded the birth rate, so importation of enslaved Africans became a necessary lifeline to maintain the numbers required to work the plantations. The fact that the slave population was not reproducing itself was evidence of the brutality and costly nature of plantation production and the slave system in Haiti. Alexander Pétion in the south and Henri Christophe in the north of Haiti both failed in all of their attempts to get the freed Africans to return to a plantation-style production and to establish the former wealth of Haiti. If we are witnessing a similar decline in the farming population, this can be interpreted as the production system reproducing its most destructive components. By the way, that also goes for the fertility of land. If crop yields are falling, this could also mean that the production system is depleting rather than maintaining the productivity of its base resource. Surveying change makers. This project became one of the best examples of groundbreaking research on climate change and small-scale farming in the Caribbean. We had 7 professional consultants interviewing small farmers in 11 CARICOM countries and conducting survey interviews of the community of actors that can be expected to support agriculture in these islands. Let us start with the surveys. Online surveys usually generated very low responses, so we were prepared to surmount this hazard by having the consultants themselves execute the survey and then fill in the details online for analysis. This resulted in 116 respondents from 11 countries in CARICOM. Respondents included farmers, fisherfolk, and technical experts in agriculture, as well as persons from government and non-governmental organizations and practicing politicians. From the perspective of the policy-making infrastructure, 44% of the respondents were persons who, by their positions, may be considered to be in the category of persons who made policy. Another 56% of respondents were persons who, by their positions, may be considered to be in the category of persons for whom policy was made. We love to say that persons have choices, but do they really? One thing that emerged strongly from our survey was that a resource manager may not have as wide a choice of resource uses as we may have thought. All farmers are resource managers, and the range of choice in their use of production methods is seldom set by the physical environment. If all you have is a parcel of land on a steep hillside, you have to learn how to farm on a steep hillside. Similarly, if you're farming on land with dubious ownership, you have to learn differently. That is, when to show and when to hide your crops. Whether one readily adapts to what the science is suggesting is not just simply knowledge and awareness. It is more often perceptions of what is real and what is not. Measuring perceptions of choice. One way of capturing a person's perception of an occasion is to find out what words are most effective to him in explaining the event. Ask our respondents to rank their perceptions about climate change as represented by 5 soundbite statements in order of their conceptual effectiveness. The responses allowed us to speculate about some of the conceptual hurdles in implementation strategies. Complexity was recognized as the most effective way of conceptualizing a paradigm for action. Complexity has never been viewed as an insurmountable hurdle in traditional agriculture in the Caribbean. Rural areas in the Caribbean are rich in diversity, but whether our system can handle the complexity is an open question. We found out that it depends on how well their traditional practices and traditional knowledge systems are rooted in recognizing and managing complexity. Political will most likely reflects the frustration of respondents at the thought that nothing ever gets done. When we combine political will and the notion of complexity, we can also interpret this as an imperative to see the issue of climate change impact in agriculture as transcending other sectoral interests towards becoming a national priority. Here we cannot help but reflect on the cautions expressed earlier about the tension between science and policy. There were other terms we used, like skepticism, non-evidential, and uncertainty, all of which reflected different degrees of disappointment with what policy could deliver. An implementation framework for building climate change resilience in Caribbean agriculture should be built on the premise that initiative is the responsibility of the individual farmer. but it cannot succeed without realizing that the creation of opportunity is the responsibility of policy. Using the environmental time clock, we had another card to play. In the second phase of our interviews, the respondents were then asked to use the environmental time clock to express their level of concern for action on each pressing issue. For each issue of choice, they were asked to indicate how close was society to running out of time in finding a viable solution. This is a ranking on the basis of climate change impact awareness and the constraints of space and time. The environmental time clock is a tool used by the Asahi Glass Foundation from Japan in their annual questionnaire on environmental problems and the survival of humankind. This poll is done in 143 countries with responses from 2,073 environmental experts. I happen to be one of the respondents being polled each year. The above picture gives you an idea of how the Asahi Foundation records the perceptions in the world about the progress being made on environmental issues. The environmental time clock works this way. 12 hours is the time of the apocalypse. When in 2021, the world thinks that we are at 9:42, it is saying that we have 2 hours and 18 minutes left before we run out of time. This is much less than what was recorded as the perception in 2020, when it was at 9:19, which then suggested that we had 2 hours and 41 minutes before we ran out of time. So we are losing time and not solving our problems. We used this tool in a slightly different way. First, we asked farmers to rank their pressing issues. In most cases, natural disasters were ranked as the highest. Then we asked them to tell us how much time they felt society had left to solve the issues relating to climate change. This ranking gave rise to an interesting observation of how the pressing issues switched positions when respondents were asked to apply the climate change clock. In 7 of our 10 countries, the number one pressing issue switched when the climate change imperative was applied. One general conclusion was that in these countries, a program that seeks to address climate change impact must be adequately framed within some very specific concerns, such as its impact on water availability in Suriname, or on poor land use in Jamaica and the Bahamas, or on increasing chemical use in Guyana and Belize. Economic response to climate change impact. The task fell to me to explain how the economics of small-scale farming would be impacted by climate change. This task became a little more complex for one reason. That is, when you use economic models to project how enterprises within a model will react, you have to ensure that the way in which you measure the impact is fully understood. The task does not require that persons understand the model, but they must understand what the model is measuring. There were 3 models that can explain the possible response among smallholders to the impact of climate change. The standard one, favored by those who are strictly economists, is called the Ricardian model. Here we are measuring how farm incomes and the value of farmland may change. The reason why this does not translate into action is that in changing their crop mix, farmers are likely to run into new pest infestations and lower soil fertility that can make the changes based on the price and income prospects of the new crop combinations not work at all. Then we had a more popular model which both economists and agronomists tended to support. It was called the Agro-Economic Crop Model, and this applied best practices in cropping system adaptations to changing climate patterns. This was the agronomists feeding their scientific determinants into an economic production function model, so as to give us the agronomically best path of response. It boasted a high level of empiricism, but it fell short of resilience because it could not recognize the coping strategies that were more risk averse than profit maximizing. In other words, this model could not cater for some persons who were willing to give up on more profits because they were uncomfortable with taking risks. My model, which I called the Agro-Ecological Zone Model, set aside all of these judgment calls about income and profits and looked to one factor: vulnerability. This is a very controversial idea because it suggests that we should look at the geographic space for a deeper response than in the economic outcomes. I wanted to look at vulnerability through the lens of time and space. In my model, it was not what we grew that mattered as much as where we grew it and when we grew it. We were arguing, based on the responses of our community of actors, that the resilience building capacity was more feasible when we changed the agro-ecological zone model. While we were not denying that carbon dioxide emissions were a primary source of climate change, we were arguing that at the farm level, we needed to look to the local geophysical impacts to determine vulnerability. The literature at that time tended to group all of the responses to climate change into one platform known as NAMA concepts, Nationally Appropriate Mitigation Actions. This refers to a set of national policies and actions that countries may undertake as part of a commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. My contribution was to promote another platform, a modified NARA concepts, that is Nationally Appropriate Resilience Actions, defined as a program of work and action focusing on integrating climate change strategies. If we had our way, we would assist governments to develop and strengthen their policies, institutions, capacities, and knowledge in the direction of an integrated approach to climate resilience in agriculture, and to make use of the full range of financing mechanisms to support such investments. What does this mean? First of all, we focused primarily on the local geophysical impact. Our key starting point was the vulnerable hotspots, which were leading farmers to adjust to climate change. Thus, the NARA concept helped us to see the convergence between natural landscape, our global causes, and the on-farm resource management techniques. It is about strategies. NARA allowed us to expand farmer knowledge systems through landscape literacy and the common cause, and to build climate resilience capacities at both the landscape level and the on-farm level. We adopted the term landscape literacy to refer to the continuous evaluation by farmers of the impact of climate change on both the microcosm of the farm and the macrocosm of the environment, which is the rainfall, temperature, sunlight, moon cycles, etc. Never mind the fact that they were likely to blame one or both for the results of their farm output. There are some farming practices which, to outsiders, may seem to be innocuous, controversial, and counterintuitive recommendations. These have to do with planting by moon cycles, tillage practices, plant spacing, irrigation timing, or residue disposal. To many farmers, this type of knowledge comes from their own collective experience. Landscape literacy is as important as practical farming skills, and they both can lead to better crop and resource management practices and to achieving impressive yield improvements and to building on recognizable mitigation strategies. The value chain impact. If you take a step back, you will recall the number of new things that have emerged since this climate change issue really appeared on our horizon. Since then, we started to differentiate between organic and non-organic crops. We saw the rise of farmers' markets. Persons started to calculate the miles our vegetables have to travel to get to our table. And we saw the advent of the label of the farm fresh story. What is happening here? My take on all of this was that farming practices were no longer simple standalone activities. Farmers were already starting to adjust to changing environmental conditions, and doing so through a range of emerging entanglements. Climate change impact at the farm/production/marketing level appear to be bending the otherwise normal channels in the value chain as part of the adaptation strategies. What the chart above seeks to do is to alert us to the changing questions that farmers are asking. In the normal trend, farmers facing a technical problem would ask the farm shop, "What do you have for whitefly infestation?" or "What do you have to kill mole crickets?" When we say that climate change was likely to bend the otherwise straight-line responses, we mean that farmers would start to counter their difficulties by recognizing the emerging strategic space and seeking to devise new practices rather than merely to look for substitutes to their current inputs. Questions about farming systems such as organic, permaculture, hydroponic, and aquaculture are beginning to find a receptive audience. The chart above can be used to identify the roles that must be performed by codes and standards and by distributors and middlemen, and finally to indicate the various types of markets that will continue to evolve.